Hello, I'm Orkun Amashov. Welcome to Headlines Special. Armenia's declared desire to join the European Union is well documented. In an attempt to give publicly verifiable credence to this very desire, and as part of a larger drive to escape Russia's gravitational pull, the government of Prime Minister Nikol Pashinyan has for some time also been floating the idea of referendum to join the European Union, in no way hinting at this happening anytime soon. On the 8th of January, the Cabinet approved the draft law on initiating the process of EU membership. This bill in question was drawn up following a successful petition by 4 extra-parliamentary forces, collectively known as Democratic Forces Platform. What is the case now is that the government has expressed its backing for this bill to be introduced into Parliament. Although the proposed bill has been described by some observers as the beginning of the accession process of the Republic of Armenia to the European Union, Prime Minister Pashinyan himself resorted to somewhat cautious language, stating that there is neither reason for particular enthusiasm nor for concern, and that the public should not expect a rapid accession, and that it would in any case require approval by referendum. Although there is no doubt in anybody's mind that the possibility of Armenia joining the European Union is not an imminent eventuality, even some people doubting whether this would happen at any point at all, the political significance of this move should not be underestimated, in particular in the light of Yerevan's publicly strained relations with Russia. What seems to be realistically possible, however, is that Armenia could upgrade its relations with the European Union, which is currently based on the Comprehensive and Enhanced Partnership Agreement signed in 2017, by formalizing a new comprehensive agenda, inter alia, including visa liberalization, for instance. There are a couple of moments of import to be considered in this regard. First of all, the question that needs to be asked and preferably answered to is whether Russia will take some drastic measures in response to the latest move, and if this new bill will become Moscow's red line, prompting some punitive measures of economic nature with some political implications. It should be borne in mind that for all the Armenia's perceived political shift towards the European Union, economically, its relations with Moscow have been flourishing, with reports suggesting that the trade turnover between Armenia and Russia has reached an impressive $10.2 billion from January to October 2024, marking a twofold increase compared to the same period back in 2023. The nature of this relationship is one of intricacy, based on mutual interests. Yerevan is economically dependent on the Kremlin, receiving cheap Russian gas and other commodities. And more importantly, Armenia itself is critical to Russia in the context of circumvention of Western sanctions levied against the Kremlin. Since the onset of the war in Ukraine, Yerevan has been somewhat involved in the re-exportation of commodities and the facilitation of trade between sanctioned Russian entities and the international market. At the same time, joining the EU would require Armenia leaving Russia-dominated Eurasian Economic Union, and the membership in this organization has been very beneficial to Armenia's economic interests. Another aspect deserving closer inspection is whether this will have some bearing upon the Azerbaijani-Armenian peace process. And today I'm going to discuss this very complex issue with my guests. Allow me to introduce them. Dr. Ashbek Kochukyan, Professor of Political Science and International Relations, currently teaching at the American University of Armenia with academic focus on foreign policies of small and weak states, questions of identity and regional development in the Middle East and Eurasia. Welcome, Professor. Gary Cartwright, former advisor to British members of the European Parliament, now publisher of EU Today, joining us from Brussels. And Dmitry Babic, political analyst with a very wide range of expertise on geopolitical issues, joining us from Moscow. Welcome to all of you, gentlemen.
Thank you, Orhan, for having me.
Bearing in mind that we're talking about Armenia and about EU aspirations, allow me to start this conversation by putting a question to Mr. Dr. Ashbek Kochukyan. The Prime Minister Pashinyan stated that this bill will only begin the process of diplomatic negotiations, adding that the government does not object to starting this process and that this does not signify the beginning of Armenia's accession to the European Union. What this cautious language employed by Pashinyan do you think signify? And To what extent do you think that Pashinyan is also considering those political forces in Armenia which are very pro-Western but also against Nikol Pashinyan himself?
A very good introduction, by the way, Orhan. I think it was quite comprehensive, the way you put it. I think to a large extent, this is more of a political move rather than a practical component. In other words, Armenia is trying to show to the West, especially the EU, that it is full-heartedly and comprehensively engaged in that direction, in the direction of the EU. Probably also one of the other elements here is that Russia, the disenchantment from Russia is a message. This is a message for Russia, Moscow. Of course, Moscow's reaction was not, late in response. They almost immediately they responded to it. But putting that aside, I think a lot of components here need to be considered. One is that at least one thing that is correct is that this takes a long time. The average membership of EU from application to accession negotiation is 9 years. But at the same time, I think this was a staged process, because I don't doubt that those who actually had a referendum or collected signatures to put this in the parliament, this bill, are sort of either instigated or supported by the government. So I think it's just more of a political move rather than a serious sort of a component. And I have a feeling, based on the EU response, is that Armenia is self-inviting itself. Armenia is also sending a big signal. It's like a wedding crasher or a party crasher, in a sense that, we want to be here. Like, we're doing all of these, so please consider our application seriously.
Thank you very much.
And in terms of the second part, in terms of the domestic component, it's an interesting overlap, right? There are pro-EU political forces who are actually against Pashinyan, but sometimes when there's any political opposition, you end up having the dividing line being, if you're pro-EU, then I'm anti-EU. So I think it would be an interesting reaction to see when the bill gets to the parliament.
Thank you, Ashpek. Gary, what is the feeling about the prospects of Armenia joining the European Union in Brussels? And how heavily do its close economic ties with Russia prey upon the minds of those policymakers whose opinion will be very critical at a later stage?
Two very good questions. To answer the first one, the process is, of course, a very long process. I personally would not have a great deal of confidence if I were in the Armenian seat at the moment. Thinking back to 2004, 2005, and how easily France blocked Turkish accession repeatedly at committee level, at plenary level, France blocked every step of the way. Here, I can see a number of opponents to Armenian accession. I think that Turkey, actually, although they're not a member, is very influential within the European Union policy-making process, and I think that Turkey may have an objection to Armenia. I think that also, after the big enlargement of 2004, some bad experiences there, mostly with the post-Soviet countries that came in, and so I suspect that the EU is going to be very, very cautious indeed. But what I would say is that I think that Pashinyan, who's suffering from a bit of a crisis of credibility at the moment, has played a blinder, as we would say in London. This is a very, very good headline. We have begun the accession process. We have initiated this. It makes it look like he's in the driving seat at this particular moment, and I would imagine that that's going to give him a bit of a boost at home. It's a very, very good headline and very, very well timed. Concerning member states blocking, is it because it's a post-Soviet state? Not necessarily. As I mentioned, there is a bit of reluctance now to move much further. Armenia, there are no outstanding conflicts. We could possibly say, because it's a rule of accession that a member state, an aspiring state, must have no border disputes. That, of course, means nothing now, because Cyprus was allowed in with an unresolved border dispute. But my personal feeling is that this is never going to be for Armenia anything more than a headline.
I see. Dimitri, what is the geopolitical value of Armenia from the perspective of Russia today, both in terms of its influence in the South Caucasus and in the context of Western sanctions levied against Moscow. Dmitry Peskov, the Kremlin spokesperson, was very cautious to state that Russia needs to understand Brussels' position and also Armenia's position, and Armenia could not join the European Union while remaining a member of the Eurasian Economic Union. But Deputy Prime Minister Mr. Overchuk used a stronger language, being more critical of Armenia. So what is the geopolitical value of Armenia at present from the Russian perspective?
Well, I would remind you of the fact that many people might forget. The same language was used against Russia and Ukraine in 2003, when former Ukrainian President Leonid Kuchma just talked about joining the joint economic space with Russia. That was the expression of the time. At the time, Günther Verheugen, who was the European Commissioner in charge of expansion, said that no way, you have to choose, you Ukrainians have to choose. You either have a joint economic space, a free trade or customs union with Russia, or you have a free trade deal and some perspective of customs union with the European Union. So it was not Russia who put the post-Soviet countries before that choice. I think it is a terrible choice. Should have never been imposed on these countries. Russia was against it. Even in 2014, when President Yanukovych was serious about joining the signing that association agreement with the EU, that tragically ended in Maidan. Even then, President Putin, suggesting his Eurasian Economic Union, said that it didn't mean that Ukraine would have to be non-European, that Ukraine would have to cut its ties to the EU. The EU said, no, if you join the Eurasian economic space, you cut your possibilities of joining the EU forever. So what's going on now? Russia is trying to be as polite as possible to Armenia. Pashinyan, despite all of his statements, despite joint exercises with NATO, was invited to the summit meetings of the CSTO, Collective Security Treaty Organization, to summit meetings of Eurasian Economic Union. We have been trying to be as polite as possible, but any patience runs out. So if Mr. Pashinyan is seriously seeking joining the EU, which means joining the EU sanctions against Russia, then of course Armenia cannot be a member of the Eurasian Economic Space. That's absolutely natural. So in that sense, Mr. Averchuk has been realistic, while Mr. Peskov is being diplomatic.
I see.
But in general, there is, of course, a feeling of frustration in Moscow about Armenia, because the statements of Pashinyan were just adventuristic. First, he wanted Russia to go to war with Azerbaijan, because Armenia went to war with Azerbaijan in 2020. Russia said no, because yes, we are members of CSTO, but even Armenia did not recognize Nagorno-Karabakh, the so-called Nagorno-Karabakh Republic, as its territory. So Armenia wanted Russia to protect the territory which Armenia itself doesn't consider its own. Of course, Russia refused. Instead, Russia, I think, played a very positive role as a mediator between Azerbaijan and Armenia. It was, let me remind you, in Russia that cessation of hostilities was agreed upon in 2020. And now Armenia is behaving more and more, I would say, arrogantly towards Russia, saying that we want to go to Europe. That was actually the purpose of Pashinyan's coming to power. And let me remind you that even before Pashinyan's coming to power, Armenia had the biggest US embassy in the South Caucasus. Americans were very active there, reformatting Armenian internal politics. So if Armenia becomes anti-Russian, if it shares the of the EU leaders on Russia, if indeed, for Mr. Pashinyan and his wife, the wife of Mr. Zelensky, is a kind of a hero, then what kind of union can we have? I think that's the message Russia is trying to send. And the message is we are trying to make it as soft as possible. We're saying that as long as you kind of abstain from radical things, as long as you don't insult us publicly, as long as you don't send weapons to Ukraine openly.
I see.
Thank you, Dmitry. I mean, we can retain some sort of relationship, but that becomes harder and harder to do.
Thank you, Dmitry. Ashbek, we will come to the subject of the impact of EU accession talks or Armenia's desire to join the European Union on the Azerbaijani-Armenian peace process a bit later. But currently, my question to you is the following. How has the war in Ukraine, do you think, altered Armenia's strategic position? Because any crisis means risks and opportunities. We understand that the idea of Armenia joining the European Union is not an imminent eventuality, but we also understand that Armenia has to take certain measures. And do you think, how conscious of the current administration in Yerevan in terms of not crossing Russia's red lines? And in your judgment, what are those red lines in the first place?
Right. Very good question, Orhan. I think there are a couple of elements here that need to be considered. First of all, the pro-Russian, anti-Russian sentiments in Yerevan, in Armenia in general. I'm not one to trust public opinion polls because it can be manipulated by questions, but it has been pro-Russian sentiments in Armenia have been declined even before Pashinyan came to power. That's one thing. Now, the question here is that there is an element, and this was sort of added. I'm talking about perceptions. These are not fact. We cannot talk about what people think as facts, but rather perceptions. The perception that Russia abandoned Armenia during the 2020 war, and that's one of the key elements that actually made Armenia hedge more towards the EU. And from this perspective, Armenia and Pashinyan, Nikol Pashinyan, wanted to endear or be endeared to the European Union, to the West. I'm talking about the West in general. I mean, the US is becoming a bit more irrelevant in the region, at least for Armenia, because it has no interest in Armenia, so mostly EU, by actually making those claims and statements and so on. Unfortunately, we don't realize that when leaders make statements for domestic consumption versus for international community, there is no line anymore separating these two. And what might be used for domestic consumption, like for instance, showing that we are going to make the country democracy and so on. By the way, this democratic shelter theory or the democratic shelter mentality that exists in Armenia after Pashinyan came to power is basically the misguided or the naive sort of approach that now that we're a democracy, the world should support us mentality among the policymakers in Armenia. The red lines, I don't believe in red lines because the red lines shift based on the circumstances. I mean, I remember in Syria, the United States put red lines for the Assad regime. If you do this, don't cross this. And then, okay, you cross that, don't cross this. No, oh, you cross that, don't cross this, and constantly renegotiating it. But there is a concern from Russia in terms of its waning influence on the region. By the way, Armenia was negotiating the EU accession, as you put it in your introduction, with SIPA, with the Comprehensive and Enhanced Partnership back in 2013 and 14, but then it was forced to drop that and join the Eurasian Economic Union under the regime then. All in all, what I'm the gist of this sort of what I'm saying is that the red lines, Armenia is. I don't know if there's a hidden agenda or something that I'm not able to see, but there is an element of recklessness in the sense that, okay, we're turning to the EU, but that will be almost at least a decade until it yields any results. But at the same time, with our action, we're antagonizing or we're pushing away Russia, which can have immediate impact. And one, just in parentheses, and I'll conclude here, is that we have to also consider the changing dynamic in the South Caucasus, where Georgia used to be the sweetheart of the EU, and now it has turned in towards Russia. And this actually is a factor that needs to be considered as to Armenia and Georgia swapping roles as being pro-Russian versus pro-European Union.
Thank you very much, Ashbek. Gary, the impression given is that Armenia, for its own perfectly understandable and to a certain extent perhaps legitimate economic interests, is acting as a conduit in terms of helping Russia in evading sanctions, advertently or inadvertently, at a time when the Western the world is hell-bent on weakening Russia economically and financially. Do you believe that for the sake of keeping Armenia's EU aspirations alive, this particular moment should be deemed tolerable for the time being?
When it comes to support of Putin's Russia, yeah, we can level allegations maybe against Armenia, but we could level the same allegations against many, many nations, some of which are actually within the EU. We could mention certain EU member states turning a blind eye to the transport of blatantly Russian fossil fuels under false flags. Armenia is not a member of the EU, and so should we be any harsher on Armenia than we are on our own member states? I would say the other way around. I think that we should be focusing on the member states that are proud to wave the flag and to take all those wonderful financial benefits from EU membership, while still just blatantly ignoring or circumventing those sanctions. And so, given the current situation of Armenia, we were talking about the economy, there was a real spurt there a few years ago. GDP was growing. There's been, I think, a lot of foreign investment leaving the country. There's been a drop in exports. So it's kind of flatlining a little bit. So we've got to understand the situation that Armenia is in. We've got to understand the situation that Pashinyan is in. He's in a very, very difficult corner at the moment. And as I say, he played a blinder with that headline, but headlines fade. As we say in England, today's newspaper is tomorrow's chip wrapper. He's going to have to pull a lot more rabbits out of hats to keep any momentum, to build any momentum. But to really answer your question, I don't think we should be too quick to judge on Armenia's circumvention of sanctions.
Dimitri, Gary believes that we should adopt some sort of understanding view, a position regarding Armenia's role. And what is the degree of appreciation for the fact that actually Armenia has been helping Russia in terms of its war effort? I mean, there are some figures. The trade turnover between Yerevan and Moscow has been increasing. And at this historic juncture, the role played by Armenia perhaps deserves some sort of appreciation. What is the feeling about it in Moscow? And to what extent do you think we perhaps have been exaggerating the role played by Armenia in terms of helping Russia?
You are definitely exaggerating the role of Armenia, because everyone, each former Soviet republic's trade with Russia grew dramatically in the last few years. You can cite Armenia, but you can also cite Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, you can cite other republics. You can cite Azerbaijan, by the way. The reason is very simple. The European Union and the United States have set themselves an unrealistic goal. They want the world to forget about 1/6 of its territory. Make it a blank spot. They may use the same tactic against China in near future. They may use it against Azerbaijan. Don't forget that we are all in the same boat with you in Azerbaijan. We are all autocracies. Autocracies. That idiotic expression of Mr. Biden and such like-minded individuals. So that policy will, of course, fail. But before it fails, it will, of course, kill a lot of people. To take a very people just say it casually, but the idea that you don't sell spare parts for Western-made planes to Russia and to Iran. What does it mean in reality? It means that thousands of people are in danger. They're in danger of a terrible death because of the decisions of several politicians. So, of course, Armenia, just like Kazakhstan, just like, United Arab Emirates, is trying to profit from that and has been profiting from that. They became one of the detours for Russia's trade with the bigger world. I don't see anything unnatural or evil here. In that sense, okay, if Armenia becomes hostile, Russia will be trading via United Arab Emirates or via some other former Soviet republic. What is going on is basically an ideological war. The war in Ukraine, for example, is not ethnic, believe me. It's ideological, And in that sense, it is a dead end, I don't want to whitewash and justify many cruelties on our side, which of course took place. But just if you think about the sequence of events, if the West just had left Ukraine in peace, it would still be a democratic country developing, and there would be normal cooperation between former Soviet republics, a lot more normal than what we have now. It was the West that was the revolutionary in this terrible story. Russia was a conservative power. Azerbaijan was a conservative power. China was a conservative power. The West was the revolutionary. And if Armenia wants to join the revolutionaries, as usual, it will be to its own expense. Because it will become a destabilizing force. That we have heard from President Aliyev, and we will hear it from many other leaders if Armenia joined the Western destabilizing war.
Thank you.
Just look what Aliyev has been saying about France in the last few months.
Thank you, Dmitry. We don't have an Azerbaijani guest here, I'm sure.
If I may... may I jump in on something that you said, that Dmitry said?
Yeah, of course, Ashbek. Let me just say one brief thing, and then the floor will be yours. What I'm effectively trying to say that had we had any Azerbaijani guests here, probably would have said that Azerbaijan is not helping Russia in terms of circumventing sanctions, and Azerbaijan is the only country in the South Caucasus. But Ashbek, please, the floor is yours. Please, by all means.
Right. No, one thing about the question that you asked, Dmitry, in terms of the reaction or how important Armenia is for Russia and backdoor, I think it's not. But the question should be the other way around. With over 40% of the volume of trade, not in terms of the amount, going with Russia, that's a major, major issue. I mean, in 2014, after the Crimea crisis, for instance, Belarus suddenly became the largest importer and exporter of frozen fish. Obviously, these are examples of how you can bypass sort of the Russian sanctions, and it takes two to tango in many, many cases, right? It's not, let's not put the blame game and then who started this or whatnot, but it takes two to tango, and I think it's not ideological what's happening, and the global change as actually has repercussions and reverberations beyond, like for instance, the Middle East and other places, and this is something that needs to be also considered.
Thank you, Ashbek. And my next question is going to be addressed to you. So let's also consider...
Just a second.
Please.
It's important, I agree with what Ashbek has said, most of it. I would just add anti-Russian sanctions. Russia never imposed sanctions first. It always imposed sanctions only in response, sometimes in a very belated response to Western sanctions.
Thank you.
And unfortunately, we cannot exclude ideology from what's going on because we cannot explain by economic interests the actions of the EU and the United States. It made no sense for the United States to go to trade war with China. And it made no sense for Germany, for example, to basically not use the pipeline which Russia built at its own expense to provide gas and oil to Germany. You cannot exclude ideology from there. Unfortunately, I would like to exclude.
Thank you, Dmitry, for your reflection. Ashbek, let's also consider the impact of Armenia's EU aspirations on the Azerbaijani-Armenian peace process. So many Azerbaijani colleagues of yours and experts would say that Azerbaijan is absolutely fine with Armenia joining the European Union in the same way Azerbaijan takes kindly to the idea of Georgia joining this bloc. Yet the fundamental Azerbaijani concern has always been that this process should not be used against Azerbaijani interests in a way Armenia reportedly used its close ties with Russia before 2020 against Azerbaijan. And in this context, of course, one of the examples used by Azerbaijani experts is that this example is related to EU civilian mission, which is currently deployed on the Armenian side of the Azerbaijani-Armenian border. And many Azerbaijani experts and Azerbaijani government officials interpret this mission as militating against the interests of the peace in the region. What do you make out of this Azerbaijani position that Armenia should not use its EU membership process or this rhetoric and against Azerbaijan?
Right. You are right on the money, Orhan. I think one of the biggest problems in any foreign policy, bilateral or multilateral, is perceptions and how you perceive the other side is doing something rather than why they're doing it. First of all, just to get it out of the way, the EU observer mission in Armenia, like there is one in Georgia, is just that, observer mission. It has no teeth, no power, no usefulness, except giving a sense of security. It gives a feeling of security and nothing more. It's not even armed. So that's one thing that needs to be understood, rather than having half-baked ideas about what constitutes, an EU observer mission. The other thing is that understanding the larger Armenian-Azerbaijani negotiations or the peace process or relation should be obviously contextualized in the post-war 2020 war context. There is one thing that both sides are not understanding, I think, in Armenia and Azerbaijan. Azerbaijan, par excellence, is a regional power now. It is not dependent on anyone. It is not anyone's sort of crony. It is autocratic, yes, without quotation marks, but that's a secondary issue. And in this context, Azerbaijan is not trying to act as a regional power in terms of lowering down its rhetoric and trying to be a regional power in the region, working with both Georgia and Armenia. On the other side, on the Armenian side, one of the latest International Republican Institute surveys, public opinion surveys that were conducted in October of last year, was that 40% of the respondents said that the main reason why they want to join the EU is because of security. Which is funny because EU doesn't have any security guarantees, right? It doesn't have an army. It doesn't have anything. It's individual members selling weapons. I mean, EU has, as Gary mentioned, has an existential crisis within its own members in terms of dealing with the Ukraine crisis. But I think the implications are big if the sides don't talk with each other. And they assume, I mean, it's like basically having a conversation. Azerbaijan and Armenia are having a conversation with each other, putting them in front of each other, but not asking questions, rather putting what they think the other side thinks in their mouth. Armenia thinks this, Azerbaijan thinks this, without actually talking with each other. But this is a momentous opportunity, I think, for Azerbaijan because it has regained its land. It has a sort of an independence movement. Iran is weak, Russia is weak, so they have become, as I said, par excellence, a regional player. Now they can make it inclusive and try to tone down their rhetoric and really become a regional power and sign an agreement with Armenia and completely remove the region out of the reach of either Russia or Iran or even the EU.
Thank you, Ashbek. I appreciate your comments. Naturally, my humble duty here is to act as a moderator, but had there been any Azerbaijani, the expert here, probably, I imagine you would have said that your description of Azerbaijan as autocracy is also a matter of perception. Probably so somebody would have said that, but thank you very much indeed. We appreciate your comments. And my last two questions will be addressed to Gary and Dmitry. Gary, do you think that this unresolved tensions between Azerbaijan and Armenia could undermine Armenia's prospects of becoming a closer partner with the European Union. Because, yes, indeed, the war is over. Indeed, the issue of Armenia sort of recognizing Azerbaijan's territorial integrity may be considered to be completed as well, although there are certain issues. As you know, there are constitutional issues, Armenia's preamble of Armenia's constitution, peace treaty has not been signed yet. Azerbaijan believes Armenia should take certain actions. But do you think that this unresolved tension between these two nations could undermine Armenia's prospects of moving away from Russia and becoming closer to European Union?
Yes, in a single word, but I think that this is not something that cannot be overcome. Personally, I think that there should be a change of leadership in Armenia. A post-conflict situation is always very, very difficult to manage, whether you win or lose. If we look back in history, I say about British history, whenever we win a war, the leader is replaced, because that's the leader that took us into the war. And people don't want any more war. And I think that Armenia would benefit from a change of leadership. It's still run by the man who took them into that conflict and who lost it. Yeah? I'm trying to kind of find the right way of saying this, but I think that the big story, and as we were discussing all of this, the big story is that this conflict is actually over. And I think that everybody should be very, very grateful for that fact, and should also acknowledge that the two leaders on both sides would have had to have done a lot of trading behind the scenes. They would have been taking a lot of risks to make that happen. And that was with other fingers in there, with Russian fingers in there, and I'm sure Western fingers in there, Turkish fingers in there. But they did it. They brought an end to that conflict. And that, I think, is a great move forward. And I think that that is what should be setting the stage. The fact that they have together achieved peace. But I do believe that Pashinyan should move over.
Thank you, Gary. And Dimitri, it's the last question of this interview on the whole. EU civilian mission on the Armenian side of the Armenian-Azerbaijani border. Ashbek earlier said that it does give Armenia some sort of sense of security, but in reality, it's not a consequential force on the ground. What is your feeling about EU civilian mission? And do you think that Russia is more or less worried about the presence of EU civilian mission there? Or you also think it's quite peripheral to the whole big picture?
Well, let's remember the results of the previous missions and the so-called Minsk group, which was supposed to bring peace to the region since the end of the previous war, I guess, in 1994. Well, if you ask me about the results of that mission, my answer will be zero. In that sense, I'm completely in agreement with President Aliyev. The Azerbaijani territory continued to be occupied for 26 more years. It was constant talk and talk and talk on the side of the Western powers, but in the end, as we know, the issue had to be resolved by military means. In the same way here, I can't quite agree with Garrick. Not that I can agree. I would not take upon myself the right to say which country needs a change of leadership. You know, I may not like President Trump, I may not like Ursula von der Leyen, but you will never hear this from any Russian politician, especially from President Putin. He would never say, "Oh, that country, that man needs to go." You know, the usual thing that you hear from Western leaders. You know, Assad needs to go, Xi Jinping needs to go, someone else has to go. No. Every country decides what kind of regime, what kind of government it wants to have. And in that sense, I'm certainly against this division of countries into democracies and autocracies. This is the most dangerous division in the current world, probably the source of many future wars. If wars are possible in future, this will be because certain countries consider themselves superior to others. And superior democratically, in terms of being more democratic. And I would not be, unfortunately, as optimistic as Garrick is about peace in Karabakh, because Armenia is quickly arming itself. France is arming Armenia. Other Western powers are arming Armenia. The tone which Western media establish about Azerbaijan is basically insulting. So I would not exclude the worst outcome. And of course, membership of Armenia in the EU, I agree with Azerbaijani analysts who view it with concern, because usually the attitude of the EU is our members and all the others. We are the garden of humanity, as Joseph Borrell said. Outside is the jungle. The garden has the right to protect itself from the jungle. The jungle has no right. That's their attitude. So I would not be as kind of optimistic as Gary is. Even though I would agree that it would be awesome if all the world had been like Britain, and if war leaders were replaced by peace leaders, like Churchill was replaced by Mr. Clement Attlee in, I guess, 1945. But if we look at history, in 99% of the cases, it was the other way around. Any leader who won the war became popular. That was the rule since the times of ancient Egypt. You know, this is unfortunately human nature. So in that sense, I would say that we all need more respect towards each other. We all need more democracy in international relations. When certain countries respect other countries and never call each other insulting names, then we will have peace.
Well, thank you very much, gentlemen. I'm most grateful to all of you. If any of you wants to say anything, I'm more than happy to hear. But otherwise, we may conclude.
Just some concluding thoughts. I think at this point, one of the key things to look at is how would Russia react? Again, as I said, EU membership is far away, where Russian reaction might be swift and faster. My only sort of parting thoughts would be, and I don't have the answer for that as well, would Russia be using the carrot on the stick or the stick by itself with Armenia in terms of its gas export and whatnot? And this is one of the things, you know, military expenditure has been on the rise in the world in general. And as Mr. Dmitry mentioned, I cannot let that go, is that he was presenting as if Armenia is the only country that is arming itself. You know, Azerbaijan is getting a lot of armaments from Israel and other places. You know, Ukraine is getting everything. Russia is getting from China. So I don't think that's an indicator in anything. It's just a political sort of indicator that you can use for your points. But again, I hope this ends up being just a political movement or maneuvering from the Armenian government. And I do wholeheartedly support what Gary mentioned in terms of sometimes change of leadership, although it's not feasible, but change of leadership can move things along.
Thank you. I'm most grateful to all of you. Thank you very much indeed. I pay my tribute and I thank Ashpek, Gary, and Dmitry. Thank you very much indeed for your time.
Thank you.
Thank you. This for Dr. Ashpek Kochukyan from Yerevan, Gary Cartwright from Brussels, and Dmitry Babich from Moscow. We discussed Armenian prospects of joining the European Union, its close and presently flourishing economic ties with Russia, and the Azerbaijani-Armenian peace process. See you very soon indeed.